This week from the global lane, Iran and Israel in direct military battle, and North Korean missiles threaten the world. Does President Trump have a grand foreign policy strategy, or is he just winging it? On the home front, Christian chaplains minister to soldiers of differing faiths. We'll examine the historic role they've played in the U.S. military. Audacious marriage. Hassani Pettiford says it's all about taking risks for a healthy and long-lasting relationship. We'll set it straight on yoga. Is it racist? Should Christians practice it? And I'll drive it home on the left's latest target for outrage. This time, it isn't Donald Trump. And it's all right here, right now, from the global lane. Israel's recent military skirmish with Iran and Hezbollah in Syria focused world attention again on the Middle East. Could it lead to a bigger war between the Ayatollah and the Jewish state? What's Donald Trump's plan to prevent a big regional conflict there? Does he even have a plan? What about North Korea? After the big show of unity at the Olympics, will Kim Jong-un resume his threats and missile launches? Could that lead to fire and fury on the Korean Peninsula? Well, joining us is Dr. Hal Brands. He's Distinguished Professor at Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And he's author of the book American Grand Strategy in the Age of Trump. Dr. Brands, does this president have a grand foreign policy strategy, or is he just kind of winging it?
I think he has a series of basic geopolitical beliefs that he's had for 20 to 30 years in some cases, which mainly add up to the idea that the United States should not play the role it's played in the world for the past 70 years, since World War II, because when the United States acts as the primary provider of international security, when it anchors the international economy, it simply allows other countries to free ride and to exploit the United States. And you can see this on the president's views on things like alliances, free trade agreements, and other issues. But he's had a hard time translating those views into a coherent program of policies, in part because some of the president's own views are contradictory, but also because he has surrounded himself almost by necessity with a group of advisors who really don't share his view of international affairs at all. And so the result is that you've had an awkward and unstable mix of what you might think of as the president's America First impulses with the more mainstream or traditionalist views of his advisors.
Well, I want to get into that a little more in a little bit here, but I know the president has worked hard to draw Sunni Arab states into a quiet alliance with Israel against Iran. So what do you think of that strategy? Is it a good one?
I think in theory it makes a fair amount of sense, and it recognizes that there is more strategic convergence than divergence between Israel and many of America's Arab partners, particularly in the Persian Gulf. But unfortunately, the way that this administration has gone about it has sometimes been counterproductive. And so the example I would give is the way in which the president at least seemed to be egging on the Saudis and the Emiratis and going after Qatar back in June 2017 at the outset of a standoff that's persisted to this day. And the idea was that doing so would force the Qataris to get serious about cracking down on financing of terrorism and force them to distance themselves from Iran. But unfortunately, it's had precisely the opposite effect. It's pushed Qatar closer to Iran because Qatar sees itself as having fewer geopolitical options these days.
Well, and the recent shoot-down of the Israeli F-16 fighter jet and the IDF airstrikes on targets in Syria, how likely are we to see more of this in the future? What should the U.S. response be to prevent a big regional war in the Middle East?
So I think we are quite likely to see more of this in the future because as ISIS is defeated, particularly in Syria, the various parties to that conflict are going to be reminded of the fact that they dislike each other almost as much as they disliked ISIS. And so certainly there's going to be continuing tension between Israel and between Iran as Iran consolidates its position in Syria. I think one of the major problems in U.S. foreign policy these days is that the United States is going to find it hard-pressed to restrain actors in that conflict because it's quite clear that we don't actually have a coherent Syria strategy at this point. So you have had the Secretary of State, for instance, say that the United States is going to leave troops in Syria more or less indefinitely as a way of pushing back against Iranian influence. But you've had the Secretary of Defense say that the United States is starting to draw down its presence in Syria. And it's not at all clear that even if the United States were to leave 2,000 to 3,000 troops in Syria, it would be sufficient to take on Iranian influence in the country. And so this is a case where I think you've seen a fairly incoherent U.S. policy that's unlikely to bring about the result we might like.
Well, more of what you're saying, conflicting views within the administration regarding North Korea. The president's fire and fury comments were not well received by diplomats around the world. But is taking a hard line against Kim Jong-un a good strategy, one that will lead to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula? What do you think?
So there's a bipartisan record of policy failure on North Korea over the past 25 years. And so this was inevitably going to be a problem that the Trump administration had to confront. And I think that the administration has actually done some fairly constructive things. They've been fairly effective in ramping up the diplomatic and economic pressure on North Korea through additional sanctions, for instance. But I think there are two basic problems. So one is that the president sometimes can't seem to get out of his own way. And so when he gets up and talks about fire and fury or totally destroying North Korea, it has the effect of switching the focus from the destabilizing actions that North Korea is taking to the destabilizing rhetoric of the American president in a way that is not helpful. And the other problem is it's just that it's not clear whether any president would be able to solve the problem of North Korea if solving it means getting to complete and verifiable denuclearization. North Korea has clearly decided that nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantee of regime security. And so I'm not quite sure what the level of pain we would have to inflict on them short of war would be in order to get them to give that up.
So few options there. Back to the America First. You had mentioned earlier, do you think there's a better grand foreign policy strategy? How likely is it that some of the president's cabinet members can influence his thinking, help shape the strategy? Of course, they have to be of one mind as well. And which secretaries do you think will likely have the most influence on the president?
So I think the basic grand strategy we ought to be following is essentially the grand strategy we followed for the past 70 years, which is a grand strategy that is premised on the idea that the United States can be most prosperous and secure when we help like-minded countries be prosperous and secure. And so we have worked to construct an overarching international order that would protect our interests and our values. And I think that has proved fairly effective over time. And I think that many of the president's advisors would agree with that sentiment. And so what you've seen over the past year is that they have tried to move the president from his own more radical instincts toward more traditional policies. They've tried to ensure that the United States continues to enhance deterrence on NATO's eastern flank, for instance. And I think Secretary Mattis at the Department of Defense has been critical in that respect. I think Secretary Tillerson has been less effective, but has made some important contributions. And so I think they have had a constructive effect on American foreign policy. The trouble is that there is a huge gap between what the advisors believe and what the president believes, and in some cases between what the president believes and what U.S. policy is. And that gap creates great uncertainty as to what America's intentions are.
And maybe even misunderstanding at times with our allies and our adversaries. Well, Dr. Hal Brands, distinguished professor and author of the book American Grand Strategy in the Age of Trump. We look forward to that book, and we thank you for your insights. President Trump has proposed a huge increase in defense spending, a budget of $716 billion for 2019. Now, while Congress debates the details, military chaplains wonder if they'll ever be allowed to pray again in the name of Jesus. In recent years, we here at CBN News have told you about numerous ordained ministers who were prohibited from openly sharing their faith as chaplains in the U.S. military. The chaplains argued they should not be required to check their faith at the door. Here with more on the important role of chaplains and faith have played in the U.S. military is historian Ronit Stahl. Dr. Stahl is author of the book Enlisting Faith, How the Military Chaplaincy Shaped Religion and State in Modern America. So tell us, what role has faith played in shaping the U.S. military over the years? How important has it been?
It's had a really important role in shaping how the military understands religion. So, for example, when we go back 100 years to World War I, when the U.S. entered World War I, which was, of course, in April of 1917, the chaplaincy was quite small and had to enlarge suddenly in order to help the military handle the millions of young men who would serve. One of the first challenges was for it to figure out how would it work with soldiers of many different faiths. Soldiers who, particularly in 1917, came from many different countries, many of whom were immigrants, and had a lot of different ideas about religion. So one of the first roles in the 20th century that the chaplaincy plays is helping the military really think through what are the different religious commitments of Americans who serve, and then how could they help them do so. And so one of the most important roles it's played is really helping the military, and through the military, America writ large, think about the range of religions that exist in America.
How important are chaplains, especially during times of war?
Well, chaplains become the main conduit to religious practice, especially on the battlefield. So one of the things chaplains have to do is to figure out how do they serve everyone in their unit. That's always been the charge of the chaplain. So one of the things chaplains do is, of course, lead worship, they bury the dead, they offer counseling, but the question is how to do that in a way that acknowledges everyone's religious freedom, that facilitates everyone's access to religion.
That must be very difficult. I mean, I can imagine say an Assembly of God pastor counseling and burying the dead for, say, a military person who basically is a Muslim. I mean, what do they really know about Islam, and how would that person respond?
Right, so that's one of the main, right, that is one of the both challenges, and for many of the chaplains I've spoken to, one of the most meaningful parts of being a chaplain. It is this expansive ability to minister and to pastor. But so part of what it requires is really learning about other faith traditions. Now, of course, when possible, the idea is to have either a chaplain or a clergy person of the person's religion do the burial. So in the case of a Muslim soldier, a Muslim chaplain or a local imam. But in times of battle, that's not always possible.
The chaplains have an impact on shaping and advancing morality in the military. What difference has that made?
It's obviously varied by soldier and by time period, but for many, the chaplain has been the person they could go to sort of regardless of circumstances, right? It's the person who chaplains have rank but no authority in the sense of harming someone's record or punishing them. It's also true that today chaplains are the one place personnel can go where it's confidential. So if they want counseling, they want to talk through an issue. And I've talked to a number of chaplains who tell me that for many personnel, it's not necessarily the sort of pastoral part of pastoral counseling, but just the ability to be a listener who will, help someone process, especially, in combat. People are seeing a lot. They want to work through it. And that the ability to help them process it, but again, keeping it confidential is really important to them.
Well, Dr. Ronit Stahl, thanks for your historical perspective today, and Go Blue.
Thanks, Go Blue.
9 million marriage proposals were made this Valentine's Day as more and more young Americans searched for their true love and their lifelong partners. But according to one survey since 2012, divorce rates have increased to 40% in America. And since 2006, the percentage of unmarried white women who have given birth has nearly tripled, from 13% to 37%. Now, experts believe more married Christian couples are also facing separation or divorce. Financial disagreements and infidelity are the main causes. Will the numbers continue to go up? How can Christians find true love today without going down the wrong path? Well, joining us now is Hassani Pettiford. He's author of the book, The Audacity of Marriage. He's also part of a Christian organization called Couples Academy. Hassani, thanks for joining us from Atlanta. What do you mean by the audacity of marriage?
Well, thank you first for having me. Now, by the audacity of marriage, to be audacious means to be daring. And it really requires you to be bold and daring in today's times in order to have a healthy, long-lasting, mutually beneficial relationship.
And how are various media and social media platforms today distorting the meaning of marriage?
Tremendously so, because we live in a very liberal culture where we don't have the same level of respect and honor for the institution of marriage as we did many years ago. And so when you see all types of scenes in television shows, movies, commercials where people can live together without getting married, sex is very casual, it really diminishes the power and the impact of what marriage should have in society today.
Has that been a sudden thing, Hassani, or has it been gradual in our society?
I think it's been gradual. I mean, it's existed for many, many years. I just think that social media and media exposes what has already been there. And what it's doing is it's beginning to shape the minds of many people all over the world because they have more access and exposure to these types of beliefs and behaviors.
More availability out there with social media, I'm sure. And
exactly.
What about Christians? Should they use dating apps to find romantic relationships? Why or why not?
Absolutely. I have no problem with a Christian using a dating app because the reality is a tool can be both good and bad depending upon the motive and the intent of it. I found my wife outside of a church building. I know many Christians who found their spouses in places that weren't in a service. You know, Christians live everywhere. We go everywhere. We do many things. So to be able to use technology in a positive way, I think could be helpful. I don't think we necessarily need to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
And maybe searching for the best apps for that. There's some that are better than others and more Christian-oriented, I'm sure. Why is infidelity becoming more prevalent among Christian couples in churches today?
I think that the marriages in the church are beginning to reflect and become a mirror image of marriages in the world. I mean, we have the same challenges, the same problems. I think that even though marriage is a principle that is taught in the church, how to have an effective, successful marriage is not. And I think that the church has done a great job championing the idea of people getting married, and hasn't done the best job of helping people to remain in a healthy marriage. So we're suffering from the same challenges that people in the world are.
Well, what do we need to do then in the church?
Number one, I think we need to teach what the Bible has to say about marriage. I heard someone once said that, you know, many Christians are biblically illiterate when it comes to the topic of marriage. They have no concept of what God's idea and purpose for marriage is. And we learn from society, we learn from friends, we learn from bad examples that we've grown up with in our homes. And so that becomes the template from which we operate from. So we need to relearn and have a better understanding of what God intended for marriage in the first place.
And finally, what kind of encouraging advice do you have for the single men and women out there, especially Christians who are eager to find true love?
That love is alive and well, and that there are many people who have phenomenal relationships. And if you desire to one day be married, I would highly recommend find a marriage mentor, find a couple who's doing it right, and glean and learn from them. Because guess what? When you go to people who have your answer and your solution, it puts you in a much better position to have a healthy relationship for yourself.
Well, Hassani, I've been married for 39 years. I think I've learned a little bit about it. I could give some good advice on it. And your book, The Audacity of Marriage, sounds interesting. We look forward to that. So thank you for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
A Michigan State University professor says white people practicing yoga are racist. A paper co-authored by MSU religious studies professor Shrina Gandhi says, quote, cultural appropriation of yoga is a continuation of white supremacy and colonialism. And some researchers are now suggesting that contrary to what the Dalai Lama says, meditation does not make people more compassionate, less aggressive, or less prejudiced. So is the way white people practice yoga racist? And although meditation and yoga have roots in Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, is it okay for Christians, regardless of their race or color, to practice yoga? Well, here to set us straight is Christian yoga instructor Christi D Geronimo. Christi, thanks for joining us today. So what do you think? Is it racist, yoga?
I have never even thought about that. Never. I've never given it one thought. But I will say that the practice of yoga is evolving over years. The history of yoga is convoluted. And although we know it did come out of India, as it's come to the West, you do have lots and lots of middle-class white ladies out there practicing yoga. That's
a lot of them.
Yes, that's how you see in yoga classes often. But I wouldn't say it's racist. Of course not. If you really adhere to yoga principles and Christian principles, you should become more compassionate and less racist, if anything.
So it does have a positive effect.
Oh, I agree totally. In my own life, I've seen it. I could go by my own experience saying yes.
Okay, now you're a Christian.
Yes.
And you know, it's very controversial. Some Christians say, oh, we shouldn't be involved in that Eastern religion. It's a practice that was started, as you say, India by Hindus and then Buddhists, as Buddhism came from Hinduism. What do you think? Should Christians be involved in yoga?
Well, obviously, since I'm a Christian, I've taught yoga now for 15 years. And I did have a problem with it in the beginning. I will say that. I did.
What was your problem?
Well, same thing you're saying, that was the concern that you'd be exposed to things that were, to spiritual principles that were contrary to Christian practice and beliefs, and get sucked into maybe worshiping deities that you weren't even aware because of the chanting in another language. And so I had a shoulder imbalance, and I thought, I am sealed by the Holy Spirit. I'm going to go and try this, because I was feeling for quite a while that God was telling me to do it, and I kept saying no. So I finally went. I trusted a teacher, and I went to the class. And over time, I felt that I was closer to Christ on the mat because of the quiet, because of settling down your body and your thoughts and your heart. At the end of class, I would say, "What would you like to say to me?" And Christ would come to me on the mat and just spend time with me there. So over time, I was convinced by the Holy Spirit that it's all about your intention. If your intention is to be in that state, you will be.
So finally, what should Christians look for? If they're going to be involved in yoga, what should they look for?
I've been at this so long, you know, I honestly don't even think about it much anymore. But I would say that if somebody's trying to engage you in a place where you are connecting with your own divinity, because we believe that, you know, we're not pantheistic. We don't believe that God is everything. We believe that we are creatures, you know, creations. So if you are directed to say that, you know, I am God and I am that, and boy, thanks be to God, I am not God.
Get out of there.
Get out. Yeah. Or seal yourself and say, I can't. Take what you can and leave the rest. Or just take yourself to a place where you know you are safe inside.
And let the Holy Spirit guide you.
Let the Holy Spirit guide you.
Some people say yoga is racist. What's your take on that?
It's exercise. That's, yeah.
Do you think Christians should practice yoga?
I think anybody can do whatever they want to do, if it's going to better themselves.
Anybody that wants to should practice yoga, regardless of race, creed, or color.
I personally don't have any problem with it at all.
I don't know. Why is it racist? Doesn't make sense to me.
Okay. Well, the second question is, do you think Christians should practice yoga?
I don't see why not.
I think anybody who wants to practice yoga should.
What about you, man? What do you think?
They're not related.
What do you mean they're not related?
Whether being Christian and practicing yoga has nothing to do with each other.
I've never heard of that being racist.
What about you, sir?
Well, if you spell it backwards, it's probably Oyo. It might be racist. I don't know.
What about you, sir?
What would make it racist? No, it's not racist.
Now, the next question is, do you think Christians should practice yoga?
I think anybody should practice yoga. It's good for you.
Anybody wants to do the splits, go for it.
Everyone should do yoga.
He's a yoga instructor.
I am a certified yoga instructor.
I don't know, I'm not a Christian, so I can't say what they should do. I mean, if it's something they want to, sure, go ahead. Interesting questions that I've never even heard before.
Okay. All right.
The American left has a new target, and it's not Donald Trump. Sure, they hate the president, but now there's someone they may hate even more, Vice President Mike Pence. They ridicule what they say is his radical or extreme Christian faith. Here's what former White House staffer Omarosa Manigault Newman said about the vice president on the CBS show Celebrity Big Brother. She said people should think twice if they want Trump impeached.
We would be begging for days of Trump back if Pence became president. That's all I'm saying. He's extreme. I'm Christian. I love Jesus. But he thinks Jesus tells him to say things that are...
Now, listen to how the hosts of the ABC show The View responded to Newman's comments. They expressed more anti-Pentecostal Christian bias.
I'm Catholic, I'm a faithful person, but I don't know that I want my vice president, speaking in tongues and having Jesus speak to him.
Like I said before,
I don't know if I want that.
It's one thing to talk to Jesus. It's another thing when Jesus talks to you.
Exactly. Okay, well, that's different.
That's different. That's called mental illness, if I'm not correct.
Mental illness? Here's what Catch the Fire pastors John and Carol Arnott said about hearing from God. Now, these comments were made during my recent live interview with them on Facebook.
I'll be thinking something else, and all of a sudden this intersecting thought will come through that, like, is biblical. And I'll go, oh, okay, Lord. And then so I kind of grab that thought and then start asking him. And then he'll say, impressions.
And they too say they've heard an audible voice from God on several occasions. So does that make the Arnotts mentally ill as well? You see, when some people don't like your views or accept your explanation, they're quick to call you crazy. Because after all, you've got to be crazy not to think or act the same way they do, right? Here's how the vice president responded.
To have ABC maintain a broadcast forum that compared Christianity to mental illness is just wrong. And it's an insult not to me, but to the vast majority of the American people who, like me, cherish their faith.
Yes, we believe in free speech in America, so Newman and the hosts of The View have the right to express their biases. But I would expect the hosts and producers of that show to be more responsible. They should do a little research and try to show the same respect and understanding for the beliefs of some Christians as they've shown to Muslims and other people of other faiths. I do not accept or admire Islam, but I love Muslims, and I respect them as human beings and their right to believe whatever they want to believe. Why don't the hosts of The View respond in the same way about Pentecostal Christians? Now, if we all embrace some of Vice President Pence's views, we'd see fewer incidents of sexual misconduct in the entertainment and sports industries in Hollywood and Washington. Because remember, the Vice President took a lot of heat last year when he championed what has become known as the Pence Rule. Actually, it began as sound advice from Billy Graham on protecting marriage. And it's this: a man should never be alone in a room with a woman other than his wife. Back in 2002, Pence told The Hill that he never eats alone with a woman other than his wife. He won't attend events featuring alcohol without her by his side. Now, he was ridiculed for possessing antiquated views, for being a misogynist. But now a majority of Americans say they believe the Pence approach is good. It's a righteous practice that wards off temptation, sexual misconduct, and evil. And we sure could use a little more of that sound thinking right now in this era of #MeToo, couldn't we? So keep on praying, Mr. Vice President. Many Americans are thankful for a praying president and a vice president who prays. Pray for our nation and for godly wisdom. Keep talking to Jesus. He is the truth, way, and life. And Mr. Vice President, take heart. The criticism is not because of you, it's really about him. Jesus told us in John 15, verse 21, "They will treat you this way because of my name, for they do not know the one who sent me." So let's not hold a grudge, let's forgive, because they know not what they do. And may we all come to truly know the love of Jesus and the one who sent him. Well, that's it from the Global Lane this week. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, iTunes, SoundCloud, and Twitter. And until next time, be blessed.